My mother took my husband after making everyone think I was crazy, so I collected proof, revealed her lies, and delivered stone-cold payback in front of all our neighbors. The first thing I remember is being 9 years old and taking a cookie from the jar. My mother got so angry that she didn't just pour dish soap down my throat, she also forced me to throw up on my bed sheets. The same sheets I couldn't wash until black mold began spreading. And when I got older, she had a change of mind. She shifted away from the borderline torture techniques and began to scream at me for not being perfect. If she told me to tidy my room and I left a spot of dust, then she'd scream at me for being a filthy pig. If she saw a single grade of anything less than 105% on my report card, because of extra credit, she would grab a match and light it right in front of me. And when this stopped making me cry, she would try to light my hair on fire with it for that extra pizzazz factor. But my favorite memory is when I moved out at 16 to live with my dad. Because he was a fat fucker who couldn't do anything for himself. He couldn't even shower without heaving like it was a marathon race. He didn't even bother cleaning under all his folds, so he walked around smelling like sour cream and onion-flavored chips. He was quite literally a 500-pound spectacle. Probably because he was constantly eating all the food in the house, while forcing me to eat just one meal every 2 days. But still, his house was practically a holiday home compared to my mother, so I helped with whatever he needed. Did all the cleaning, cooking, and even learned how to do his taxes. And he wasn't an insane perfectionist, so it didn't seem bad at all. But when I turned 18, he gave me the greatest gift of all. He committed self-unalive. I still remember the joy that ran through my body that day, knowing I'd get a whole house to myself. And I was in his will, so I received a sum of around $30,000. Paired with FAFSA, this was enough to fund my education. Fast forward to 6 years later. I recently became a qualified paralegal with my first stable income and Toyota Corolla. I felt like I was on top of the world. And by this point, I had heard my mom was living with her friend or something. I wasn't sure of the details, I just knew she was out of my life, and that was enough for me. But when I was around 26, she came knocking on my door. She was in tears, and all of her belongings were in black bin bags. I just stared at her. Apparently she really was living with her friend, but her friend had gotten so tired of her promising to be better, promising that she'd get a job. She told her if she didn't find a way to make money soon, she would kick her, my mom, out. And instead of my mom making the decision to finally be a somewhat productive member of society, she downloaded an online gambling app and put the entirety of the rest of her savings on red. Sigh. After that, her friend gave her a year to get her life together, and since she never did, now she needed somewhere to crash. I looked her up and down. I was 5'4", while she was 4'11". I looked into her beady, evil eyes. How scared of her I had once been. How my inner child craved love from her for almost my entire life before finally giving up. I wanted to grab the AK-47 from my bedroom and gum her down, but instead I smiled and told her she was more than welcome to stay with me and husband. Under one condition, of course. She had to follow the house rules. She thanked me profusely, and I helped her move into the guest bedroom. The next morning I woke her up at 4 a.m. with a megaphone. Wake up, wake up. She tried to wrap her pillow around her ears, but I threw it against the wall before beginning to recite the rules. 1. The toilet seat must be sat on and heated for me at 6 a.m., 12 p.m., and 6 p.m. If I find it cold, then she has to do her business in the front garden. 2. Wake up time is 4 a.m., sleep time is 7 p.m. If she is found awake during those hours, I will take away all her clothing for the week. 3. Water is only allowed to be drank every second day. 4. All chores must be done from 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. before me and my husband wake up. If they are not completed, I will do my business in her bedroom for the entire week, and she will have to clean it up every time. 5. There must be 2 meals a day cooked to my liking. If it is not done quietly enough, then her meal will consist of the stale bread me and my husband don't want. 6. I will read all her mail, texts, and emails. There must be at least one message sent a day describing what an amazing and beautiful daughter I am. 7. She must remind me each day about how sorry she is for her treatment of me, how I deserved better, and she deserves nothing. And of course, if she doesn't make herself scarce enough. AKA, if I feel like I'm sick of looking at her, I will drop her off at O Block with a packed lunch and water bottle, wearing the skimpiest outfit I can find. She said I was awful, that I was selfish, immature, and rude, but I didn't care. You see, these were the exact rules my mother plagued my entire childhood with, and for the first 2 days, she actually tried. I was honestly somewhat impressed with her efforts, until the 3rd day came and my husband never came home from work. I stared at her, while the weight of the deal I'd made began to sink in. I called his cell phone repeatedly, each unanswered ring increasing my anxiety. I called his office, his friends, even the hospitals. Nothing. When I finally confronted her, she was sitting in the living room, calmly flipping through a magazine as if nothing was wrong. The overhead light cast harsh shadows across her face, making her features look sharp and predatory. "You won't get away with this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She laughed, the sound like glass breaking. "I already have. Your husband was so easy to manipulate. All I had to do was tell him about your little GN collection, your obsessive rules, how you become just like me." Her laugh echoed in our living room, bouncing off the family photos that lined the walls, photos of Evan and me on our honeymoon in Maui, at his sister's wedding, building our first snowman together outside this very house. The GN collection she mentioned was a fabrication. I owned exactly one firearm, a small handgun Evan had insisted I keep for protection after a break-in at our neighbor's house last year. It stayed locked in a safe in our bedroom closet, untouched except for the one time Evan had taken me to a shooting range to learn how to use it properly. My stomach dropped. Had she poisoned Evan against me? Made him believe I was turning into her? "He didn't believe you," I said, but doubt crept in. Had Evan seen the similarities between my rules for my mother and her rules for me? Had he been frightened by what he saw? Evan knew some of my history with my mother, the sanitized version I'd shared over late-night conversations early in our relationship, but I'd never told him everything, never described the washing liquid burning my throat, or the matches singeing my hair, or the hunger pangs that kept me awake at night. I'd been too ashamed, too afraid he'd see me differently. Now I wondered if that silence had created the perfect gap for my mother to fill with her own twisted narrative. Didn't he? She smiled, her thin lips curling upward like a snake preparing to strike. Why do you think he was so eager to meet me alone that night? To hear my side of the story? Her smile was the same one she'd worn when I was a child, and she'd caught me in some minor transgression, a mixture of triumph and anticipation for the punishment to come. She sat with perfect posture in our armchair, her small feet barely touching the floor, hands folded primly in her lap. The magazine she'd been reading was one of Evan's automotive journals, open to an article about classic car restoration, his passion project for the vintage Mustang sitting in our garage. I felt sick. Had Evan gone willingly with her? Number, I refused to believe it. Whatever happened, she had done something to him. The scratch marks on the driveway, the watch behind the trash can. This wasn't a voluntary disappearance. I'd noticed those scratch marks that morning, 4 parallel lines in the concrete of our driveway, as if someone had dragged something sharp across it. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it, assuming neighborhood kids had been playing, but now they took on a sinister significance. And Evan's watch, his grandfather's vintage Omega that he never took off. I'd found it partially hidden behind our outdoor trash can when I'd taken out the garbage that evening. The leather strap was torn, and the face was cracked, as if it had been ripped from his wrist during a struggle. I'm going to find him, I said, gathering my evidence. And when I do, you'll regret ever coming back into my life. Her smile never faltered. Good luck with that, dear. I've had decades of practice covering my tracks. The confidence in her voice sent chills down my spine. What exactly did she mean by covering her tracks? Had there been others before Evan? I thought of her friend who had finally kicked her out after a year of broken promises. Had something happened there too? I gathered the watch, placing it carefully in a plastic bag like I'd seen detectives do on TV shows. I took photos of the scratch marks on the driveway with my phone, the flash illuminating them starkly against the dark concrete. I even checked our security camera, only to find that the footage from the previous night had been deleted, something that required our household password. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, replaying every interaction with Evan in the days before he disappeared. Had he seemed distant? Concerned? I couldn't remember anything unusual. We'd been happy, normal. At least I thought we had been. Our last morning together had been ordinary in every way. Evan had kissed me goodbye as he always did, his lips tasting of coffee and the mint toothpaste he preferred. He'd been wearing his blue dress shirt, the one I'd ironed the night before, and the tie I'd given him for his birthday last year. We talked about dinner plans while he packed his lunch, agreeing to try the new tie place that had opened downtown. He'd texted me around noon with a silly meme about paralegals that had made me laugh out loud in my quiet office. Nothing in his behavior had suggested fear or concern. Nothing had hinted that our life together was about to be shattered. On day 15, I changed tactics. If the police wouldn't help me, and if confronting my mother directly only gave her ammunition, I needed allies. People who knew the truth about her. People who could corroborate my story. The police had been frustratingly dismissive when I'd reported Evan missing. Adults have the right to leave, the officer had said, barely looking up from his computer as he filled out the report, especially when there might be domestic issues. He'd glanced meaningfully at my mother, who had accompanied me to the station, playing the role of the concerned mother-in-law perfectly. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, murmuring about how worried she was about poor Evan, and how stressed I'd been lately. The officer had nodded sympathetically, to her, not to me. I called Casey, my oldest friend from high school who had witnessed my mother's abuse firsthand. Then Stephanie, my college roommate who'd helped me through the nightmares. And finally, Marcus, Evan's best friend who had been in our wedding party. I need your help, I told each of them. It's about my mother, and Evan. Casey had been there the time my mother had locked me in the hall closet for 6 hours because I'd gotten mud on the kitchen floor. She'd heard my muffled cries through the door when she'd come over to work on a school project. Stephanie had held me countless nights during our freshman year when I'd wake up screaming, convinced my mother was in our dorm room with a box of matches. And Marcus knew Evan better than anyone. They'd been friends since elementary school, had been roommates in college, had stood beside each other at their respective weddings. If anyone could help me figure out what had happened to Evan, it was these 3 people. They arrived that evening, one by one, parking down the street as I'd instructed. I met them at the back door and led them to the basement, where I'd set up my laptop with all the evidence I'd gathered. Our basement was finished but rarely used, a relic from the previous owners who had envisioned it as a rec room. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the carpet was a faded beige that had seen better days. I'd set up a card table in the center, surrounded by folding chairs borrowed from the garage. My laptop sat open, displaying a folder labeled Evidence that contained photos, videos, and notes I'd compiled over the past 2 weeks. A corkboard leaned against the wall, covered with printouts, sticky notes, and red string connecting related items, a visual representation of my increasingly desperate investigation. Jesus, Marcus whispered, as he watched the footage of my mother's late-night phone call, his broad shoulders tensing. You think she did something to Evan? The footage was grainy, captured by a nanny cam I'd hidden in a bookshelf after Evan disappeared. It showed my mother in our kitchen at 2 a.m., speaking intently into her cell phone, her voice too low to make out the words, but her body language animated and purposeful. At one point, she laughed, a chilling sound in the silent house, and nodded as if agreeing to something. The timestamp showed this was the night before Evan vanished. I know she did, I said, my voice hardening with certainty. Look at this. I showed them the journal entry, the credit card statement, the security footage from our neighbor's doorbell camera that caught a glimpse of my mother leading a stumbling figure to a car at 2 a.m. The journal entry was from my mother's personal diary, which I'd found hidden beneath the mattress in the guest room. Plan in motion, it read. E suspects nothing. We'll be over soon. The credit card statement showed a purchase at a hardware store the day after she moved in. Items listed included duct tape, rope, and a prepaid cell phone. And the security footage, though blurry and distant, clearly showed 2 figures in our driveway in the middle of the night. One small and upright, my mother. The other larger and unsteady, Evan, moving toward a car I didn't recognize. Your mother was always a monster, Casey said, squeezing my hand, her green eyes filled with the same protective fury I remembered from high school. But this This is beyond anything I imagined. Casey looked exactly as she had in high school, tall and athletic, with short blonde hair and intense green eyes that missed nothing. She'd been my defender then, the one person who would stand up to bullies on my behalf when I was too conditioned to submission to defend myself. She'd gone on to become a social worker, specializing in child abuse cases. The irony that she now sat in my basement, helping me deal with the same abuser all these years later, wasn't lost on either of us. "We need to go to the police," Stephanie insisted, tucking her auburn hair behind her ear nervously. Stephanie was the cautious one of our group, always advocating for following proper channels and procedures. Her neat appearance, pressed slacks, and a buttoned cardigan despite the late hour, reflected her orderly mind. As a high school counselor, she dealt with troubled teens daily, always finding the right balance between empathy and authority. But even her professional composure was shaken by what I'd shown them. I tried. They didn't take me seriously. And she's right. She's been documenting everything I've done since she moved in. The rules, the megaphone, everything. She'll make me look unstable. I showed them the notebook I'd found in her room, filled with detailed accounts of my abusive behavior since she'd arrived. Each entry was dated and timed, describing how I'd tortured her with early wake-up calls, restricted her water intake, and subjected her to humiliating rules. She'd even taken photos of herself looking exhausted and tearful, carefully staged to maximize sympathy from whoever saw them. It was a masterclass in manipulation, one I should have expected from someone who had spent decades perfecting her techniques. "Then we need to make her confess," Marcus said, his jaw set, "or find Evan ourselves." Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his 6 feet 2 inches frame seeming too large for our basement. His dark beard was neatly trimmed, but his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. He'd been searching for Evan on his own, I realized, even before I called. The gold band on his left ring finger caught the light as he gestured toward the evidence board. His wife, Tara, had texted me daily since Evan's disappearance, offering help and support. Now I understood why. Marcus had suspected something was wrong all along. We formulated a plan. Simple but potentially effective. My friends would stay hidden, and I would invite my mother to the living room for tea. One by one, they would emerge, confront her with what they knew about her past abuse, and ask about Evan. The pressure, the unexpected witnesses, might be enough to make her crack. We rehearsed our timing, our positions, our questions. Casey would emerge first from the kitchen, then Stephanie from the hallway, and finally Marcus from the study. Each would block a potential exit route while adding another layer of pressure. We agreed on a safe word, pineapple, that any of us could use if things seemed to be escalating dangerously. I set up my phone to record the entire conversation, hiding it beneath a stack of magazines on the coffee table. That evening I called my mother into the living room, the scent of chamomile wafting through the air. "I thought we could have tea," I said, my voice deliberately light. "Talk about old times." The chamomile tea had been Stephanie's suggestion. "It has calming properties," she'd explained. "Might make her more receptive." I'd arranged cookies on a plate, store-bought shortbread that my mother had always preferred, and used our best china, the set that had belonged to my grandmother. The living room was warm and inviting, with soft lamplight casting a golden glow over the comfortable furniture. To anyone looking in from outside, it would have appeared to be a normal evening, a mother and daughter enjoying a quiet moment together. She looked suspicious but sat down, her small frame perched on the edge of the sofa like a bird ready to take flight. "What's this about?" She was wearing clothes I'd never seen before, a pale blue blouse and navy slacks that must have been new. Her hair was neatly styled, and she wore makeup, something she hadn't bothered with since arriving. She prepared for this conversation, I realized, just as I had. The thought sent a chill through me, despite the warm room. "I've been thinking about the past," I said, pouring her a cup, the amber liquid steaming in the delicate china I'd inherited from my father. "About how things were when I was growing up." The teapot was heavy in my hands, and I had to concentrate to keep it steady as I poured. The china had been one of the few personal items my father had kept after divorcing my mother, a family heirloom he'd insisted on taking with him. After his death, I'd found it carefully wrapped in tissue paper and stored in a box labeled "For Mira" in his messy handwriting. Using it now with her felt both wrong and right, a reclaiming of something that connected me to him rather than her. She stiffened. Ancient history. Her fingers twitched slightly as she reached for her cup, the only outward sign of her discomfort. Her nails were perfectly manicured, another new development since she'd arrived. I wondered if she'd been preparing for this confrontation all along, or if she had other plans that required her to look presentable. "Is it?" Casey stepped into the living room, making my mother jump. "Hello, Mrs. Adams. Remember me? I was there when you locked your daughter in the closet for getting an A- on her math test." Casey moved with the confident stride of someone who confronted abusers professionally. She positioned herself by the doorway to the kitchen, effectively blocking that exit. My mother's tea sloshed over the rim of her cup as she startled, leaving a small brown stain on her new blouse. My mother's face drained of color. "What is this?" For a moment she looked her age. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the deep lines around her mouth and eyes, the thin skin of her neck, the age spots on her hands. Fear made her look older, smaller, more vulnerable, but I reminded myself that this was all part of her act. She was never more dangerous than when she appeared weakest. "Just a reunion," Stephanie said, entering from the kitchen. "I remember driving Mira to therapy, after she had nightmares about you trying to set her hair on fire." Stephanie stood tall and professional, her counselor's demeanor in full effect. She carried a folder, empty, but my mother didn't know that, and wore an expression of clinical concern. She positioned herself near the hallway that led to the bedrooms, cutting off another escape route. "You have no right," my mother began, but Marcus cut her off as he emerged from the hallway. "Where's Evan?" he asked, his voice cold. "What did you do to my best friend?" Marcus was the most intimidating of the three, tall and broad-shouldered, with a deep voice that carried authority. He stood with his arms crossed, his stance wide, taking up space in a way that made the room feel suddenly smaller. My mother's eyes darted to him, then to the front door, her last remaining exit, only to find it blocked by his imposing figure. My mother's eyes darted between them, calculating, For a moment, I thought our plan was working. She looked cornered, frightened. Then she laughed. It wasn't her usual laugh, the sharp, glass-breaking sound I'd grown to dread. This was different, lower, more controlled, almost amused. It was the laugh of someone who had just realized they held a winning hand in a game their opponent thought they were losing. "How dramatic," she said, setting down her teacup with a steady hand. "Bringing in your little friends to intimidate an old woman. Is this how you treat all your guests, Mira? Or just your mother?" The tremor in her hands was gone now. She sat back on the sofa, suddenly at ease, crossing her legs and smoothing her slacks with a practiced gesture. The frightened, cornered look had vanished, replaced by something more calculating, more confident. She'd assessed the situation and decided it posed no real threat to her. "We know what you did," I said, "to me as a child, and now to Evan." My voice sounded thin and young to my own ears, lacking the strength I'd hoped to project. The familiar pattern was reasserting itself, her confidence growing as mine diminished. I gripped the arm of my chair, feeling the rough texture of the fabric against my palm, using the sensation to ground myself in the present rather than slipping back into childhood patterns of submission. "You don't know anything," she snapped, standing up, "and neither do your friends. They only heard your side of the story, the poor, abused daughter, never the struggling single mother doing her best with a difficult child." She stood with perfect posture, suddenly seeming taller than her 4 feet 11 inches frame. Her voice took on the reasonable, slightly martyred tone she had always used with teachers, doctors, and social workers, the voice that had convinced so many professionals that I was the problem, not her. It was chilling how easily she slipped back into this role, how convincing she could sound even now. "Mrs. Adams," Marcus said, stepping forward, "Evan is missing. His watch was found in the garage. His credit card was used by you. These aren't stories. These are facts." Marcus held up his phone, displaying the credit card statement I'd shown them earlier. The screen's blue light illuminated his serious expression as he scrolled through the evidence we'd gathered. His voice remained steady and authoritative, cutting through my mother's performance with simple, undeniable facts. For a split second, something flickered across my mother's face. Fear? Guilt? But it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "I'm tired," she announced. "I'm going to bed. And when I wake up, I expect these people to be gone from my daughter's house." She brushed an invisible piece of lint from her sleeve, her movements deliberate and unhurried. The momentary crack in her facade had been sealed, plastered over with the same impenetrable confidence she'd always projected. She stood and straightened her blouse, adjusting the small pearl earrings I hadn't noticed earlier. She walked out, head high, leaving us staring after her. "That didn't work," Casey said, deflated. Casey slumped into the chair my mother had vacated, running a hand through her short blonde hair in frustration. The confidence she'd displayed earlier had diminished, replaced by the same helpless anger I remembered from our high school days, when she'd tried and failed to get authorities to take my situation seriously. "No," I agreed. "But did you see her face when Marcus mentioned the evidence? She's worried." I picked up my mother's abandoned teacup, noticing that she'd barely touched the liquid. The cookies remained untouched on their plate, perfectly arranged, just as I'd left them. Even in this small detail, she denied me the satisfaction of accepting what I'd offered. "Not worried enough," Stephanie said. Stephanie paced the living room, her practical low heels making soft thuds on the carpet. Her professional composure had slipped, revealing the worried friend beneath. She chewed her lower lip, a habit from college I hadn't seen in years, as she considered our failed plan. "We need to follow her," Marcus suggested. "She might lead us to Evan." Marcus was already checking his watch, calculating. His practical nature, the same quality that made him an excellent project manager at his engineering firm, was kicking in. Where our emotional appeal had failed, he was ready to shift to logistics and surveillance. That night, we took shifts watching the house. Casey took first watch, then Stephanie, then Marcus. I tried to sleep but couldn't, my mind racing with images of Evan in danger. I lay in our bed, the bed Evan and I had shared for 5 years, staring at the ceiling fan slowly rotating above me. The sheets still smelled faintly of his cologne, a woodsy scent I'd teased him about when we first met, but had grown to love. The house creaked and settled around me, ordinary sounds that now seemed ominous. Every few minutes, I checked my phone for updates from whoever was on watch, the screen's harsh light momentarily blinding me in the darkness. Around 1:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "She's on the move." I threw on clothes and crept downstairs. Marcus was by the front window, peering through the blinds. "She just left," he whispered. "Walking, not driving." I pulled on a dark hoodie over my t-shirt and jeans, slipping my feet into sneakers without bothering with socks. My hair was a mess, but I didn't take time to brush it, just pulled it back into a hasty ponytail. Marcus was dressed entirely in black, looking more like a special ops agent than an engineer. He handed me a small flashlight, the beam already adjusted to its dimmest setting. "Let's go," I said, grabbing my car keys, the metal cold against my palm. The night air was cool against my face as we stepped outside, carrying the scent of someone's fireplace and the jasmine that grew along our fence. The street was quiet, most houses dark except for porch lights, and the occasional blue flicker of a television through curtained windows. My mother was already halfway down the block, a small figure moving purposefully through pools of streetlight and shadow. We followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. My mother moved with purpose, checking over her shoulder occasionally but never spotting us. She walked for nearly 20 minutes, finally stopping at a 24-hour convenience store, its fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow on the empty parking lot. The convenience store was one I passed daily on my way to work but rarely entered, a small, somewhat dingy place that sold overpriced groceries and lottery tickets. Its harsh lighting spilled onto the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, creating sharp contrast between light and shadow. A single car was parked near the entrance, probably belonging to the board cashier visible through the large front windows. My mother didn't approach the store's entrance but instead skirted around the edge of the property. "Is this it?" Marcus whispered as we watched from across the street. "A snack run?" We crouched behind a parked car, its metal still warm from the day's heat. Marcus's breath was steady beside me, his training as a former college athlete evident in his controlled movements and measured breathing. My own heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it must be audible. Each hit a painful thud against my ribs. But my mother didn't go inside. Instead, she walked around to the back of the building where a row of payphones stood, relics from another era that somehow still existed. "She's making a call," I said, straining to see. That's why her phone never showed any suspicious calls. She's using payphones. The payphones were ancient. 3 metal booths lined up against the back wall of the store, partially illuminated by a flickering security light. I hadn't even realized they still worked in this age of cell phones. My mother stood at the middle one, her back to us, one hand pressed against her ear, while the other gesticulated emphatically. Her small figure cast a long shadow across the cracked concrete. We were too far away to hear, but I could see her gesturing angrily, her free hand cutting through the air. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Then she hung up and started walking again, this time in a different direction. She slammed the receiver down with such force that we could hear the plastic crack even from our hiding place. Then she stood for a moment perfectly still, as if gathering herself. When she began walking again, her pace was faster, more determined, her shoulders set in a rigid line I recognized from childhood. The posture that meant she had made a decision and nothing would deter her. We followed her for another 10 minutes until she reached a small self-storage facility, the kind with roll-up metal doors and minimal security. She punched a code into the keypad at the entrance and slipped inside. The storage facility was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, its entrance illuminated by a single security light that cast more shadows than it dispelled. The sign above the gate, Secure Store 24/7 Access, was missing several letters, the remaining ones glowing dimly in faded neon. Beyond the gate, rows of identical metal doors stretched into the darkness, their padlocks glinting occasionally when caught by the light. "We need to get in there," I said, my heart racing. "The gate needs a code," Marcus pointed out. I tugged at the gate experimentally, the metal cold and unyielding against my fingers. The keypad glowed green in the darkness, waiting for the 4-digit code that would grant access. I tried my birthday again, 1493, but the light remained stubbornly red. My mother had used a different code here. I studied the facility. The fence was about 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire. But at one corner, a large dumpster stood against the fence. "There," I said, pointing. "We can climb on that and get over." The dumpster was overflowing with cardboard boxes and construction debris, creating an unintentional staircase that reached almost to the top of the fence. The smell of rotting garbage and wet cardboard wafted toward us as we approached, making my stomach turn. A rat scurried away from the base of the dumpster as we drew near, its eyes reflecting the dim light before it disappeared into the darkness. We made our way around the block, approaching the dumpster from the back alley. Marcus gave me a boost, and I scrambled onto the dumpster, then carefully maneuvered over the fence, avoiding the barbed wire. Marcus followed, his height making it easier for him. The metal of the dumpster was slick with dew, making it treacherous to climb. I slipped once, scraping my palm on the rough edge, feeling the sharp sting and the warm trickle of blood. The fence swayed slightly under my weight as I balanced at the top, carefully swinging my legs over to avoid the barbed wire. The drop to the other side was longer than I expected, and I landed awkwardly, twisting my ankle slightly. Marcus landed beside me with more grace, immediately pulling me into the shadow of the nearest storage unit. Inside, we crouched low, moving between the rows of storage units. The facility was dark, with only a few security lights casting long shadows. "Which one is she in?" Marcus whispered. The storage units stretched in identical rows, their metal doors reflecting the minimal light. Numbers were painted on each door, 100, 101, 102, continuing down the row. We moved cautiously, our footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the concrete, despite our efforts to be silent. The air smelled of dust and metal and something else, a faint chemical odor I couldn't identify. I didn't know, but then I saw a faint light spilling from under one of the doors, about halfway down the row. We crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through a small gap between the door and the ground I could see movement. My mother's shoes pacing back and forth, then another pair of shoes, men's shoes, not moving. "Evan," I breathed, my heart pounding against my ribs. The light was dim, probably from a battery-powered lantern or flashlight, but it was enough to see the shoes clearly. My mother wore her practical walking shoes, the ones she'd arrived in. The men's shoes were brown leather Oxfords, Evan's favorite pair, the ones he wore to important meetings. They were scuffed now, the polish dulled, but unmistakably his. They remained stationary while my mother's moved around them, her small feet taking quick, agitated steps. We needed to see inside. The units on either side were dark and locked, but the one directly across had its padlock hanging open. "In here," I whispered, pulling Marcus into the unlocked unit. The unlocked unit's door rolled up with a soft rumble that seemed deafening in the quiet facility. We froze, waiting to see if the sound had alerted my mother, but the movement of feet continued uninterrupted in the unit across the way. Relieved, we slipped inside, carefully lowering the door behind us until only a small gap remained at the bottom for light and air. It was empty except for some broken furniture and old boxes, but most importantly, it had a small vent near the ceiling that looked into the adjacent units. Marcus gave me a boost, and I peered through the vent into my mother's unit, the smell of dust and mildew filling my nostrils. The vent was covered with a metal grate, but several of the slats were bent or missing, creating gaps large enough to see through. The metal was cold against my face as I pressed close, straining to see into the dimly lit unit across the narrow corridor. Dust tickled my nose, and I had to fight the urge to sneeze as I positioned my eye at the largest opening. What I saw made my blood run cold. Evan was there, sitting on a folding chair, his hands bound behind him. He looked thin and exhausted, with several days' growth of beard, but he was alive. My mother stood in front of him, speaking in low, angry tones I couldn't quite make out. Evan's usually immaculate appearance was gone. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair matted on one side as if he'd been sleeping on a hard surface. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and a cut on his cheekbone that had scabbed over. But his eyes were alert, following my mother's movements with wary attention. The storage unit itself was mostly empty, except for the chair Evan sat on, a small table with the lantern, and what looked like a sleeping bag rolled up in one corner. I shifted, trying to hear better, and my foot slipped. I grabbed the wall to steady myself, but my hand hit one of the boxes, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the quiet facility. The box contained what felt like books or photo albums, heavy objects that made a substantial thud when they hit the concrete floor. The sound seemed to bounce off every metal door, amplified in the quiet night. I froze, my body rigid with fear, as Marcus quickly lowered me from my perch. My mother stopped talking mid-sentence. "What was that?" I heard her say clearly. Her voice carried easily through the thin walls of the storage units, sharp with suspicion and alarm. There was a moment of complete silence, as if the entire facility was holding its breath along with us. "Stay here," my mother's voice commanded. "Make a sound, and I'll make sure she suffers before she dies." The casual cruelty in her voice was familiar, the same tone she'd used when threatening me as a child. But hearing her threaten to cow me as an adult sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was about elimination. Footsteps approached our hiding place. The door to our unit creaked open. Light spilled in as my mother peered inside, a flashlight in her hand. We had hidden behind a stack of boxes, and for a heart-stopping moment, the beam of light passed right over our hiding spot. The flashlight beam swept across the unit methodically, illuminating dust motes floating in the air, and the decrepit furniture pushed against the walls. I could see my mother's small feet from our hiding place, her sensible shoes now dusty from the storage facility floor. She took 2 steps into the unit, the flashlight beam bouncing as she moved. Marcus and I pressed ourselves against the wall, hardly daring to breathe, as the light came closer to our hiding spot. But she didn't see us. After what felt like an eternity, she closed the door again. "Just some rats," I heard her say as she returned to her unit. Her footsteps receded, followed by the sound of her storage unit door rolling open, and then closed again. The metallic click of the padlock engaging seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. Marcus and I remained frozen in our hiding place, waiting to be certain she wasn't coming back. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until we heard her unit door roll shut and the padlock click into place. Then we crept out and back to the fence. "We need to call the police now," Marcus said, once we were safely back on the street. "We have proof. We saw him." We had made our way back over the fence the same way we'd entered, though the return journey seemed more difficult. My muscles ached from tension, and my scraped palms stung as I gripped the metal fence. Once back on the street, we moved quickly away from the storage facility, not slowing until we were several blocks distant. Marcus pulled out his phone, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. "And tell them what?" I asked. "That we broke into a storage facility and peeped through a vent? She'll be gone with him before they even get a warrant." The frustration in my voice was palpable. We had found Evan, alive, thank God, but we were still trapped in the same impossible situation. My mother was too clever, too prepared. She had contingency plans for her contingency plans, and she had already poisoned the well with the police, making me appear unstable and vindictive. Then what do we do? I thought of Evan, bound and helpless. Of my mother, threatening to make me suffer before killing me. The familiar cold fear I'd lived with as a child washed over me, but this time it was followed by something else. Resolve. Standing under the harsh glow of a streetlight, I felt something shift inside me. The paralyzing fear that had been my constant companion since childhood receded, replaced by a clarity I'd never experienced before. My mother had taken so much from me, my childhood, my sense of safety, nearly my sanity. I would not let her take Evan too. "We get him out ourselves," I said. "Tonight." The words hung in the night air between us, simple but profound. Not a plea for help, not a desperate hope, but a statement of intent, a decision. Marcus studied my face for a long moment, then nodded once, firmly. He understood. This was no longer about following rules or proper procedures. This was about survival. We returned to the house and woke Casey and Stephanie. I explained what we'd seen and what we needed to do. "This is insane," Stephanie said. "We should call the police." Stephanie sat at my kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd made but wasn't drinking. Her professional demeanor had completely dissolved, replaced by genuine fear. The kitchen clock showed 3:15 a.m., and the harsh overhead light emphasized the exhaustion on all our faces. And risk her hurting Evan? Or disappearing with him? I shook my head. "We know where he is now. We can get him out." I paced the kitchen as I spoke, unable to remain still. The adrenaline from our discovery still coursed through my system, making my movements jerky and my thoughts race. On the counter lay the items we'd gathered: flashlights, a first aid kit, bolt cutters Marcus had found in our garage, and the car keys to Casey's SUV, which we decided would be best for transporting Evan if he was injured. "How?" Casey asked. I laid out my plan. It was risky, but it could work. We would wait until my mother left for her usual 4 a.m. chore time. Then, while she was busy in the house, the 4 of us would go to the storage facility, break into the unit, and rescue Evan. The plan was simple by necessity. We had limited time and resources. Casey would drive, with Stephanie navigating. Marcus and I would handle the actual break-in, using the bolt cutters on the padlock. We'd bring water and energy bars for Evan, plus a blanket in case he was cold or in shock. The first aid kit contained basic supplies that might be needed if he was injured beyond what we'd seen. "What about your mother?" Marcus asked. "She'll know it was you." Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression serious. He'd changed into dark clothes again, practical for our mission but also somewhat intimidating. His question cut to the heart of our dilemma. Even if we rescued Evan tonight, my mother would still be a threat. "Let her," I said, my voice hard. "Once Evan is safe, we'll have all the evidence we need to put her away for good." I met each of their gazes in turn, letting them see my determination. This wasn't just about rescuing Evan anymore. It was about ending my mother's hold over me once and for all. About finally standing up to the monster who had terrorized my childhood and now threatened my adult life. About reclaiming my power. We waited, tense and silent, as the hours crept by. At 3:55 a.m., right on schedule, my mother's door opened. I watched through the hidden camera as she made her way to the kitchen to begin her morning chores, her movements mechanical and precise. The hidden camera, a small device disguised as a smoke detector, showed my mother in her robe and slippers, her hair neatly braided for sleep. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been following the same routine for days, heading straight to the kitchen where she would begin preparing breakfast and cleaning. She seemed completely unaware that anything was amiss, that her captive had been discovered, that her carefully constructed plan was about to unravel. "Now," I whispered to my friends, who were waiting by the back door. We slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness and piled into Marcus's car, which we'd parked around the corner. We moved silently through the dewy grass of the backyard, staying close to the fence where shadows were deepest. Casey led the way, her athletic grace making her movements nearly soundless. Stephanie followed, then me, with Marcus bringing up the rear, constantly checking behind us to ensure my mother hadn't spotted our escape. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet grass and distant rain. The streets were empty as we drove to the storage facility, the same code box glowing green at the entrance. "We need that code," Casey said. Casey had parked the SUV a block away from the storage facility, its dark blue color blending into the pre-dawn shadows. We approached on foot, moving quickly but cautiously, alert for any sign of my mother or her mysterious male accomplice. The storage facility looked exactly as it had hours earlier, quiet, dimly lit, surrounded by its chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. I remembered watching my mother punch it in. "I think it's 1437, I said, uncertain. "Or maybe 1473. I closed my eyes, trying to visualize my mother's fingers on the keypad. The memory was blurry. I'd been focused on her face, not her hands, when we followed her earlier. But I had glimpsed the movement, 4 quick taps in a pattern that seemed familiar somehow. Marcus tried the first combination. Nothing. He tried the second. The light turned green, and the gate began to slide open. "How did you know?" Stephanie asked as we drove in. "It's my birthday," I said grimly. "January 4th, 1993. The realization sent a chill through me. Even in this, her secret storage unit where she kept my husband captive, she couldn't help but use a number connected to me. It was a twisted kind of possessiveness, a way of marking everything in her life with my existence. The gate slid open with a mechanical hum, revealing the rows of identical storage units stretching into the darkness. We parked near the unit and approached cautiously. The padlock was sturdy. We'd need bolt cutters or a key. "Check under the mat," Casey suggested. "People always hide keys there." Casey's suggestion seemed absurd in the context. This wasn't a suburban home, but a secure storage facility. Yet there was indeed a small rubber mat in front of the unit, the kind used to wipe feet before entering. It seemed out of place among the industrial surroundings, a domestic touch that felt jarring. "This isn't a suburban home," I started to say, but Marcus was already lifting the small rubber mat in front of the unit. Underneath was a key. "Unbelievable," he muttered, picking it up. The key was attached to a small plastic tag with the unit number written in my mother's neat handwriting. It was so obvious, so careless, that it momentarily stunned us all. After all her careful planning, all her manipulations, she had resorted to the most basic hiding place imaginable. Perhaps she'd never expected anyone to track her to this location. Or perhaps, more chillingly, she hadn't planned on needing to return many more times. The lock opened with a click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet facility. Marcus and I rolled up the door, while Casey and Stephanie kept watch. Evan was still there, slumped in the chair, his eyes closed. For a terrible moment, I thought we were too late. Then his chest rose and fell with a shallow breath. The storage unit was dimly lit by a battery-powered lantern placed on a small folding table. The space was mostly empty except for Evan's chair, the table, and a sleeping bag rolled up in one corner. The air inside was stale and carried a faint chemical smell. Chloroform, I realized with a sick feeling. The walls were bare metal, and the concrete floor was stained in places with substances I didn't want to identify. "Evan," I whispered, rushing to him. "Evan, it's me." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with recognition. "Mira?" His voice was a hoarse croak. His skin was clammy under my touch, his usually healthy complexion now pale and waxy. His wrists were raw where the ropes had chafed them. Dried blood crusted around the edges of the wounds. His clothes, the same ones he'd been wearing when he disappeared, were wrinkled and stained with sweat and what looked like food spills. But his eyes, when they focused on me, were clear and alert, filling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We're getting you out of here," I said, working at the ropes binding his wrists while Marcus cut the ones around his ankles. "Your mother," he mumbled. "She said you sent her, that you wanted to teach me a lesson." His words sent a fresh wave of rage through me. Of course she would tell him that. The perfect way to destroy his trust in me, to isolate him completely. I could imagine her spinning the tale, making it seem like I was punishing him for some imagined transgression, using the same manipulative tactics she'd employed throughout my childhood. "She lied," I said fiercely. "I've been looking for you since you disappeared." I cupped his face in my hands, forcing him to meet my eyes, willing him to see the truth there. His skin was rough with stubble, his cheeks hollowed from lack of proper nutrition, but underneath the physical changes, he was still my Evan, still the man who had loved me through nightmares and panic attacks, who had held me when memories of my childhood became too much to bear alone. Once freed, Evan tried to stand, but stumbled. He was weak from dehydration and hunger. Marcus and I supported him between us as we made our way back to the car. "We need to get him to a hospital," Stephanie said, looking at Evan's condition with concern. Evan's legs buckled as we helped him walk, his muscles weak from days of being bound to the chair. His breathing was labored, and he winced with each step, suggesting injuries we couldn't see beneath his clothing. Stephanie walked ahead of us, constantly checking around corners to ensure our path remained clear. Casey had brought the SUV as close as possible to the unit, its engine running quietly, ready for a quick escape. "Not yet," I said. "My mother will check the hospitals first when she realizes he's gone. We need somewhere safe." The thought of my mother finding us at the hospital sent panic through me. I could picture her arriving in tears, telling the staff she was Evan's mother-in-law, that I was unstable and dangerous. She would be convincing, she always was, and in his weakened state, Evan would be vulnerable, unable to defend himself or contradict her story. My place, Casey offered. It's on the other side of town. She doesn't know where I live. Casey's apartment was in a secure building with a doorman and security cameras, features she'd insisted on as a single woman living alone in the city. It was also in an area my mother was unlikely to know or visit, far from our usual haunts. The perfect temporary sanctuary, while we figured out our next steps. We drove there in tense silence, constantly checking the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. Evan drifted in and out of consciousness in the back seat, his head resting on my shoulder, his familiar scent now mingled with sweat and fear. The city was beginning to wake up around us, early commuters heading to work, delivery trucks making their rounds, street sweepers clearing the previous day's debris. Casey drove carefully, avoiding main roads where possible, taking a circuitous route to her apartment. Evan's weight against my shoulder was both comforting and concerning. I was relieved to have him physically present after 2 weeks of desperate searching, but alarmed by his weakened condition. At Casey's apartment, we helped Evan to the couch and gave him water and some leftover soup that Casey heated up. Color slowly returned to his face as he ate. "What happened?" I asked gently. "How did she get you?" Casey's apartment was warm and inviting, decorated in soft blues and greys with comfortable furniture and good lighting. She brought extra blankets for Evan, tucking them around him with the practiced care of someone used to helping others. The soup was simple chicken noodle, but Evan ate it like it was a gourmet meal, his hands shaking slightly as he held the spoon. Evan took a shaky breath. "She called me at work, said you were having some kind of breakdown, that you'd threatened her with a GN. She sounded so scared, so convincing. She asked me to meet her at that storage place to talk about getting you help." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, the warm food and water reviving him. He sat up straighter on the couch, the blanket pulled around his waist, his eyes more focused now. The cut on his cheekbone looked worse in the bright light of Casey's apartment, deeper than I'd initially thought, with signs of infection around the edges. My stomach twisted. Of course she'd used my mental health against me, just like she always had. "When I got there," Evan continued, "she was crying, saying she was afraid for her life. Then someone hit me from behind. When I woke up, I was tied to that chair." He rubbed the back of his head as he spoke, wincing slightly. I gently parted his hair, finding a raised lump and dried blood where he'd been struck. The injury wasn't bleeding anymore, but it would need proper medical attention soon to prevent complications. "Someone?" I repeated. "There was someone else?" Evan nodded weakly. "A man. I never saw his face clearly. He came by a few times, but your mother did most of the talking." The hesitation in his voice made my heart ache. What had she said to him during those long days of captivity? What poison had she dripped into his ears about me, about our marriage, about our future? The man he mentioned must be the same one who had argued with my mother earlier, the one who had walked out, apparently unwilling to escalate to murder. The way he hesitated made my skin crawl. "Did she hurt you?" Evan looked away. "She wanted information, about our finances, the house deed, your father's will. When I wouldn't tell her, she'd leave me without water for a day." His reluctance to meet my eyes told me there was more. Worse things he wasn't ready to share. But even what he admitted was horrifying enough. She had tortured my husband for information about money, about property. The casual cruelty of withholding water, a basic human need, was so familiar from my own childhood that it made my stomach churn with remembered thirst. Rage boiled inside me. She hadn't just taken Evan to hurt me. She wanted everything I had. My husband, my home, my father's legacy. She wanted to erase me completely. The realization crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. This wasn't just about control or punishment. This was about complete annihilation, erasing me from existence and stepping into my life as if I had never been, taking my husband, my home, my financial security, becoming me in a twisted way while disposing of the original, the ultimate expression of the possessiveness that had characterized her parenting. "We need to record your testimony," I said, pulling out my phone. "Everything she did, everything she said. We'll take it to the police." My hands were steady as I set up the recording, finding strength and purpose. This would be evidence, irrefutable proof of what my mother had done. No more dismissals from skeptical officers, no more being painted as the unstable one. Evan's testimony would validate everything I'd been saying, everything I'd experienced. Evan nodded, and I started recording as he recounted the details of his captivity. When he finished, I stopped the recording and sent it to all 4 of our email accounts for safekeeping. "What now?" Marcus asked. "Your mother will realize he's gone soon." The sky outside Casey's apartment was lightening, the first pale streaks of dawn appearing on the horizon. Time was running out. Soon my mother would finish her morning chores and expect me to emerge from my bedroom at 7 a.m. When she discovered both Evan and I were missing, she would know her plan had failed. What would she do then? I checked the time. 5:30 a.m. She would be finishing the morning chores, expecting me to wake up at 7 a.m. as usual. "I need to go back," I said. The words fell into the room like stones, creating ripples of shock on my friends' faces. Casey stopped mid-motion, a fresh glass of water for Evan suspended in her hand. Stephanie's eyes widened in alarm. Marcus stepped forward as if to physically prevent me from leaving. "What?" No exclamation mark. Evan grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong for his weakened state. "She's dangerous. She'll hurt you." His fingers tightened around mine, warm and familiar despite the ordeal he'd been through. His eyes, though tired, were intense with concern, the same look he'd given me when I'd told him about my childhood, when he'd promised nothing like that would ever happen to me again. The irony wasn't lost on me. If I'm not there when she expects me, she'll know something's wrong. She'll run. We need to keep her thinking everything's normal until the police can arrest her. My logic was sound, but I understood their fear. I was proposing to walk back into the lion's den, to face the woman who had threatened to call me just hours earlier. But it was our best chance to end this permanently, to ensure she faced consequences for her actions, rather than disappearing to plot another attack. "Then I'm coming with you," Marcus said. I shook my head. "Stay with Evan. Keep him safe. I'll be fine." Marcus stood with his arms crossed, his stance wide and solid, the same protective posture he'd adopted when we confronted my mother earlier. He was Evan's oldest friend, his best man at our wedding, the person who knew him better than anyone except me. If I couldn't stay to protect Evan myself, Marcus was the next best option. At least take this, Casey said, handing me a small canister of pepper spray, just in case. The pepper spray was small enough to fit in my palm, its metal surface cool against my skin. Casey demonstrated how to use it, thumb on the safety, aim for the eyes, spray in a quick burst, then run. A simple defense, but potentially effective if I needed those crucial seconds to escape. I hugged Evan carefully, mindful of his injuries. I'll be back soon, I promised. With the police. His body felt thinner in my arms, but his embrace was still strong. Still Evan. He smelled of Casey's soap now. She'd given him a washcloth to clean up while the soup was heating, but underneath was the familiar scent that meant home to me. I pressed my face against his neck for a moment, drawing strength from his presence before pulling away. Marcus drove me back to my neighborhood, dropping me off a block away from my house. I walked the rest of the way, rehearsing my performance in my head. Act normal. Pretend nothing has changed. The neighborhood was quiet in the early morning light, sprinklers turning on in perfectly manicured lawns, newspapers waiting on doorsteps. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the sidewalk as I approached our house. My house, I reminded myself. Not hers. Never hers. The pepper spray was a reassuring weight in my pocket as I climbed the porch steps, inserted my key in the lock, and stepped inside. The house was quiet when I slipped back in through the back door. I could hear my mother in the kitchen, humming as she prepared breakfast, just like a normal, loving mother would. The sound made my skin crawl. The tune she hummed was vaguely familiar, something she used to sing when I was very young, before the abuse escalated. The normality of it was jarring after everything that had happened. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon, warm and inviting. She had set the table for two, with placemats and cloth napkins, as if this were a pleasant family breakfast, rather than a charade masking kidnapping and threats of murder. I went upstairs to my bedroom and messed up the bed to make it look like I'd slept there. Then I took a quick shower, letting the water run loudly enough for her to hear. The shower helped wash away the night's tension, the hot water soothing my aching muscles. I scrubbed thoroughly, as if I could wash away not just the physical dirt, but the memory of the storage unit, the sight of Evan bound to that chair, the sound of my mother threatening to kill me. I dressed in clean clothes, jeans and a simple blouse, comfortable shoes I could run in if necessary. The pepper spray went into my pocket, easily accessible. At exactly 7 a.m., I came downstairs, schooling my features into a neutral expression. "Good morning," my mother chirped, setting a plate of eggs on the table. "Sleep well?" She looked fresh and well-rested, wearing a floral blouse I'd never seen before and neat slacks. Her hair was styled, her makeup perfect. Nothing in her appearance suggested she had spent part of the night threatening a captive in a storage unit. The disconnect between her pleasant demeanor and the reality of her actions was dizzying. "Fine," I said, sitting down. The eggs looked perfect, as always. I wondered if they were poisoned. The eggs were scrambled with cheese and chives, just the way I liked them as a child. Toast was buttered and cut into triangles, arranged neatly on a separate plate. Orange juice filled a crystal glass that caught the morning light, sending small rainbows dancing across the tablecloth. The domestic perfection of it all was surreal after the night's events. "I was thinking," she said, sitting across from me with her own plate, "maybe we could ease up on some of those rules. Now that I've shown I can follow them." She took a small bite of her eggs, chewing delicately, watching me over the rim of her coffee cup. Her eyes were calculating despite her casual tone. She was testing me, I realized, seeing if I knew anything, if I suspected anything. The rules had served their purpose, documenting my abuse while giving her freedom to act. Now she was ready for the next phase of her plan. I stared at her, amazed by her audacity. She was planning something. Maybe she thought Evan would never be found, that I'd eventually give up looking and accept whatever story she spun about his disappearance. "We'll see," I said noncommittally, pushing the eggs around my plate without eating. I couldn't bring myself to eat food she had prepared, not after everything. Each time I lifted my fork, I imagined her hands adding something to the eggs. Poison, sedatives, something to make me compliant or worse. The pepper spray in my pocket pressed against my thigh, a small comfort in this surreal breakfast scene. "Not hungry?" she asked, her eyes sharp. "Just tired," I lied. "Didn't sleep well." I forced myself to take a small bite, then another, fighting against my instinct to refuse anything she offered. The eggs tasted normal, delicious even, but each swallow was an effort. I kept my expression neutral, matching her performance with one of my own. Two could play at this game of pretend normality. "You should eat," she insisted. "Keep your strength up." The way she said it sent chills down my spine, like she was fattening me up for slaughter. There was something almost predatory in the way she watched me eat, as if measuring my strength, calculating how much fight I had left in me. I wondered what she had planned for today. Would she try to lure me to the storage facility as she had Evan? Or did she have something else in mind, something that would happen here in the house where neighbors might hear if I screamed? "I'll eat later," I said, standing up. "I need to get ready for work." Her smile faltered. "Work? But it's Saturday." For a moment, genuine confusion crossed her face. She hadn't expected this deviation from routine. Saturday was supposed to be a day at home, where she could monitor me, control me, perhaps implement whatever she had planned next. My announcement had disrupted her schedule. "Emergency at the office," I improvised. "I'll be back this afternoon." I grabbed my purse and keys, feeling her eyes boring into my back as I headed for the door. The weight of her gaze was almost physical, like pressure between my shoulder blades. I resisted the urge to run, to show any sign that I knew what she had done. Instead, I walked calmly, keys jingling in my hand, the picture of a professional woman heading to an unexpected workday. Outside, I took a deep breath of fresh air, fighting the urge to run and never look back. Instead, I drove straight to the police station. This time, I wasn't leaving without being heard. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from the neighbor's yard. Birds sang in the maple tree that shaded our driveway, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below them. I got into my car, the silver Corolla that had once represented my freedom, and started the engine, watching the house in my rearview mirror until I turned the corner. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally, to let my hands shake on the steering wheel, to acknowledge the fear that had been my constant companion since my mother's return. The same officer who had taken my missing person report was at the desk. He looked up with recognition and a hint of annoyance. "Ma'am, we're still looking into your husband's case, but as I explained..." Officer Jenkins, I remembered his name now, was in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and the slightly weary expression of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. His desk was cluttered with paperwork, coffee cups, and framed photos of what I assumed were his children. He had been polite but dismissive when I'd first reported Evan missing, clearly categorizing it as a domestic dispute rather than a genuine emergency. "I found him," I interrupted, placing my phone on the desk. "And I have evidence that my mother kidnapped him and held him captive." My voice was steady, my gaze direct. I was no longer the frantic wife reporting a missing husband. I was a witness to a crime, with evidence to support my claims. The change in my demeanor seemed to register with Officer Jenkins, whose expression shifted from annoyance to cautious interest. That got his attention. I played Evan's recorded testimony, watching the officer's expression change from skepticism to concern. "Where is your husband now?" he asked when the recording finished. As Evan's voice filled the small space between us, describing his captivity in detail, Officer Jenkins's posture changed. He sat up straighter, his eyes focused on my phone, his hand reaching for a notepad. By the time the recording ended, he was already on his feet, signaling to a colleague across the room. "Safe," I said, "with friends. He needs medical attention, but we were afraid my mother would find him at a hospital." I didn't mention Casey's apartment specifically, still cautious about sharing too much information that might somehow get back to my mother. The memory of her network of payphones and secret storage units made me wary of how far her reach might extend. "And your mother? Where is she?" "At my house. She doesn't know that I know." The words felt strange leaving my mouth, a simple summary of a situation so complex and twisted that it defied easy explanation. How could I convey the years of abuse, the careful manipulation, the calculated cruelty that had led to this moment? How could I make them understand the danger she posed, not just to Evan but to me? The officer called his superior, and soon I was sitting in an interview room with 2 detectives going through everything again. I showed them the footage from my hidden cameras, the photos of my mother's journal, the credit card statement, everything. The interview room was small and utilitarian, with beige walls and a simple table with 4 chairs. Detective Ronan Gray was tall and thin, with intense blue eyes that missed nothing. His partner, Detective Maria Sanchez, was shorter with a no-nonsense manner that somehow put me at ease. They listened without interrupting as I went through my evidence, occasionally exchanging glances but reserving judgment. "This is substantial," Detective Ronan Gray said, reviewing the evidence. "But we'll need to speak with your husband directly." Detective Gray spread the evidence across the table. Printouts of credit card statements, screenshots from security cameras, photos of the storage unit. His long fingers traced connections between items, his expression thoughtful. Detective Sanchez took detailed notes, her handwriting neat and precise despite the speed at which she wrote. "I can take you to him," I offered, "but please, my mother can't know. She has someone helping her, a man. If she realizes Evan is free, she might run, or worse." The thought of my mother discovering Evan's rescue before the police could apprehend her sent fresh waves of anxiety through me. What would she do if cornered? Who else might she hurt in her desperation to escape consequences? The mysterious man who had helped her. Who was he? And might he return despite their argument? The detectives exchanged looks. "We'll send officers to your house now to bring her in for questioning," Detective Gray said. "In the meantime, Officer Young will accompany you to your husband's location." Detective Gray made a call, his voice low and urgent as he requested officers for what he termed a high-risk apprehension. Detective Sanchez explained that Officer Young would accompany me to ensure both my safety and the proper handling of evidence. Young was a female officer, she noted, experienced in dealing with domestic violence cases. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, my mother would face consequences for her actions. Officer Young and I drove to Casey's apartment. On the way, I called Marcus to let him know we were coming. But when we arrived, the apartment was empty. "They were just here," I said, panic rising in my throat. "I don't understand." Casey's apartment showed signs of hasty departure. A half-empty glass of water on the coffee table, blankets crumpled on the couch where Evan had been sitting, a first aid kit open on the kitchen counter. But no Casey, no Stephanie, no Marcus, no Evan. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Officer Young was on his radio immediately, calling in the situation. I tried calling Marcus, Casey, Stephanie. No one answered. My phone buzzed with a text. Unknown number. "I warned you what would happen if you cross me. Now they'll all pay." Attached was a photo of Evan, Marcus, Casey, and Stephanie, all bound and gagged in what looked like a basement. My basement. The photo was dimly lit, but clear enough to see their faces, all 4 conscious, all 4 terrified. They sat in a row against the wall of my basement, bound to chairs with what looked like duct tape. Evan's injuries were visible even in the poor lighting, the cut on his cheek now an angry red. Casey's eye was swollen, suggesting she had fought back. Marcus and Stephanie looked dazed, perhaps drugged. Behind them, partially visible, was the water heater I recognized from my own basement. "She has them," I whispered, showing Officer Young the text. "At my house." Officer Young's professional demeanor cracked slightly, her eyes widening as she saw the image. She was on her radio again immediately, her voice urgent as she reported the development. "Multiple hostages confirmed at the Adams residence. Suspect is armed and dangerous. Requesting immediate backup and hostage negotiation team." More officers arrived, including the detectives I'd spoken with earlier. They showed me photos of my house, the front door standing open, no sign of my mother or the officers sent to question her. "We need to approach carefully," Detective Gray said. "If she has hostages, this is now a high-risk situation." The photos showed my house surrounded by police vehicles, their lights flashing silently in the morning sun. Officers in tactical gear positioned themselves around the perimeter, weapons drawn but held at ready positions. My quiet suburban street had been transformed into something from a television crime drama, neighbors watching from behind hastily closed curtains, or standing in small clusters at a safe distance. "Let me talk to her," I pleaded. "She wants me. That's all she's ever wanted. I knew my mother better than anyone. I understood her patterns, her motivations, her weaknesses. If anyone could reach her, could convince her to release her hostages without violence, it was me. The thought terrified me, but the alternative, a violent confrontation with 4 innocent people in the crossfire, was unthinkable. Absolutely not, the detective said firmly. We're calling in the hostage negotiation team. Detective Gray's expression was sympathetic but unyielding. He explained that trained negotiators had protocols for these situations, techniques that had been proven effective. Allowing me to speak with my mother would only give her what she wanted, me, vulnerable and within her reach. It would make the situation more volatile, not less. But I knew my mother. She wouldn't negotiate. She wouldn't surrender. She would hurt the people I loved just to punish me, just like she always had. My mother operated on a different logic than most people. Conventional approaches wouldn't work with her. She didn't care about her own safety or freedom. She cared about control, about power, about making me suffer. A negotiator offering her safe passage or reduced charges would have no leverage because those weren't the things she valued. The only currency that mattered to her was pain, specifically my pain. While the police set up a perimeter around my house and tried to establish contact, I slipped away. There was another way into my house, through the old storm cellar that connected to the basement. My father had shown me the entrance, hidden behind the garden shed, when I first moved in with him. The police had established roadblocks at both ends of my street, with officers positioned around the house itself, but they didn't know about the neighbor's yard that backed up to mine, separated only by a low fence that was mostly hidden by overgrown rhododendron bushes. While they focused on the front and back entrances, I circled around through 3 adjacent properties, staying low and out of sight. The police had the front and back covered, but they didn't know about this entrance. I made my way through neighboring yards, staying low and out of sight, until I reached my backyard. The shed stood undisturbed, exactly as it had for years. Behind it, partially covered by overgrown bushes, was the storm cellar door. The shed was a small wooden structure my father had built years ago, now weathered to a silvery grey. Behind it, almost completely hidden by the sprawling branches of an old rhododendron, was the storm cellar door, 2 slanted wooden panels that opened outward, leading to concrete steps below. The hinges were rusted, the wood warped from years of exposure to the elements. My father had shown me this entrance when I first moved in, explaining it was a relic from when the house was built in the 1940s, before modern basement access became standard. It creaked as I pulled it open, the sound making me wince. I paused, listening for any reaction from inside the house. Nothing. The creak seemed deafening in the tense silence, a high-pitched protest of metal against metal that surely must have alerted everyone within hearing distance. I froze, half expecting to hear shouts or footsteps, but there was only the distant sound of police radios, and the occasional car passing the roadblocks at the end of the street. The tunnel was dark and smelled of damp earth. I used my phone's flashlight to guide my way, moving as quietly as possible. At the end was another door that opened into a corner of the basement behind the old water heater. I could hear voices now, my mother's sharp and angry, and a man's lower and calmer. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. They were arguing. The tunnel was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing me to crouch as I moved forward. The earthen walls were supported by ancient wooden beams that creaked ominously above my head. The air was thick with the smell of soil and mildew, making each breath an effort. My phone's flashlight cast eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of my progress. After about 20 feet, the dirt floor gave way to concrete steps, leading up to a wooden door, the entrance to my basement. I peered around the water heater. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Evan, Marcus, Casey, and Stephanie were tied to chairs in the center of the room, just as in the photo. My mother paced in front of them, a kitchen knife in her hand. The man stood by the stairs, his back to me. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket. The scene was like something from a nightmare. My friends and husband bound and helpless, my mother stalking back and forth before them like a predator, deciding which prey to consume first. The knife in her hand caught the light as she gestured, its blade reflecting the single bulb overhead. Evan's eyes were alert despite his injuries, following my mother's movements carefully. Casey had indeed been struck. Her left eye was swollen shut, a dark bruise spreading across her cheekbone. Stephanie and Marcus sat rigidly in their chairs, their expressions a mixture of fear and defiance. "This wasn't the plan," the man was saying. "Kidnapping 4 people? Are you insane?" The man's voice was deep and resonant, with a slight accent I couldn't place. He stood with his back to me, his posture tense, hands clenched at his sides. His dark jacket was expensive-looking, out of place in the dusty basement. From my hiding place, I could see only his profile, a strong jaw, straight nose, dark hair cut short at the neck. "They know too much," my mother hissed. "They found him. They know what we did." My mother's face was flushed with anger, her movements jerky and unpredictable as she paced. She looked smaller in the basement's dim light, but somehow more dangerous, like a cornered animal ready to lash out at anything that moved. The knife in her hand seemed to be an extension of her arm, moving with her as naturally as if she'd been born holding it. "That's your problem," the man said. "I'm out." He turned toward the stairs, and I got my first clear look at his face. I didn't recognize him, but something about him seemed familiar. The shape of his nose, the set of his jaw. His face was handsome in a conventional way. Strong features, clear eyes, the kind of face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd but would be considered attractive. There was something in his bone structure that nagged at me, a familiarity I couldn't place. Had I seen him before? Was he someone connected to my mother's past or mine? "You can't leave," my mother said, her voice rising. "We had a deal. You help me get rid of her, and you get half of everything." Her voice took on a wheedling quality I recognized from childhood, the tone she used when trying to manipulate someone into doing what she wanted. It was strange to hear it directed at someone other than me, to watch her tactics from the outside rather than experiencing them firsthand. "Half of what? A house? Some savings? It's not worth murder charges." The man's dismissive tone clearly angered my mother. He spoke to her as if she were a child having a tantrum, rather than a dangerous woman holding 4 people hostage. His confidence suggested he didn't truly fear her, despite the knife in her hand and the hostages bound before them. It's more than that, my mother insisted. Her father left her everything. The house, the money, the land upstate. It's worth millions. My mother's voice took on a dreamy quality as she spoke of this imagined wealth, her eyes unfocused as if seeing the riches she believed existed. The knife lowered slightly as her attention shifted from her immediate surroundings to the fantasy she had constructed. Land upstate? My father didn't own any land upstate. What was she talking about? The confusion momentarily distracted me from the danger of the situation. My father had left me the house and his modest savings, approximately $30,000, most of which had gone toward my education. There had never been any mention of land upstate or hidden millions. Was this another of my mother's delusions, or had my father kept secrets I never discovered? The man shook his head. You're delusional. I'm calling this off. He started up the stairs, but my mother moved with surprising speed. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back. You're not going anywhere, she snarled. You're in this as deep as I am. Your DNA is all over that storage unit. Her small hand clutched his sleeve with surprising strength, her nails digging into the fabric of his jacket. The knife in her other hand came up, not quite threatening him directly, but positioned where he couldn't ignore it. Her face was contorted with rage, all pretense of reasonableness abandoned. The man wrenched his arm free. Touch me again, and I'll break your neck. He towered over her, his physical advantage obvious as he looked down at her with contempt. There was no fear in his expression, only disgust and impatience, as if she were an unpleasant task he regretted undertaking. His hand moved to his pocket, perhaps reaching for a phone or a weapon of his own. My mother's face contorted with rage. She raised the knife, but the man was faster. He caught her wrist, twisting until she dropped the weapon with a cry of pain. You're on your own, he said, shoving her away. He turned and continued up the stairs. The knife clattered to the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the basement. My mother stumbled backward from the force of his shove, nearly falling before catching herself against the wall. Her face registered shock before transforming into pure hatred. Her small features twisted into something barely recognizable as human. My mother scrambled for the knife, her movements frantic. You ungrateful bastard, she screamed after him. After everything I've done for you. She lunged for the knife, her fingers closing around the handle with desperate intensity. Her screams were primal, filled with a rage that seemed to transcend the immediate situation. Whatever relationship existed between her and this man, it clearly went deeper than a simple criminal partnership. The man paused at the top of the stairs, looking back with contempt. You've never done anything for anyone but yourself. He opened the door and disappeared. Moments later, I heard the front door open and close. His parting words hung in the air, a simple truth that seemed to cut through my mother's defenses more effectively than any physical attack could have. For a moment, she seemed frozen by his assessment, her face slack with something that might have been hurt before hardening again into determination. My mother stood alone in the basement, breathing heavily, the knife clutched in her hand. Then she turned to her captives, her face a mask of cold fury. Well, she said, approaching Evan, looks like it's just us now. She moved toward Evan with deliberate slowness, the knife held loosely at her side. Her expression had changed, the frantic rage replaced by something colder, more calculated. She reached out with her free hand to touch his face, a parody of a gentle caress that made him flinch away despite his restraints. I had to act. If I waited for the police to find the storm cellar, it might be too late. I looked around for a weapon and spotted an old baseball bat leaning against the wall near me. I grabbed it, took a deep breath, and stepped out from my hiding place. The bat was my father's, left behind like so many of his possessions when he died. It was solid wood, worn smooth from years of use, heavier than I remembered from the few times he'd tried to teach me to play. My palms were sweaty as I gripped it, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone must hear it. But there was no time for fear. Evan's life, all their lives, depended on me acting now. Get away from him, I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. I stepped fully into the light, the bat raised to shoulder height, my stance wide and balanced as if I were preparing to swing at a fastball. The basement fell silent except for the soft hum of the water heater behind me. 4 pairs of eyes, Evan's, Casey's, Stephanie's, and Marcus's, widened with a mixture of hope and alarm at my appearance. My mother whirled around, her eyes widening in shock. You! She hissed. How did you get in here? She spun to face me, the knife now raised defensively. For a moment she looked genuinely surprised, her carefully constructed plans disrupted by my unexpected entrance. Then her expression shifted, calculation replacing shock as she assessed this new development. Put down the knife, I said, advancing slowly, the bat raised. It's over, Mom. The police are outside. They know everything. I moved forward one careful step at a time, keeping the bat between us, my eyes never leaving the knife in her hand. Behind her, I could see Evan struggling against his bonds, trying to free himself now that her attention was diverted. Casey was doing the same, her athletic frame straining against the duct tape that bound her to the chair. She laughed, a high, brittle sound. They don't know anything, and neither do you. Her laugh echoed in the basement, bouncing off the concrete walls and low ceiling. It was the same laugh I remembered from childhood, the one that preceded some new cruelty, some fresh torment. But this time I wasn't a helpless child. This time I was ready. Lying, she repeated, her grip on the knife tightening. You want to talk about lies? How about the lie your father told you, that he loved you, that he wanted you? Her words were designed to hurt, to distract, to make me doubt myself, the same tactics she'd used throughout my childhood. She took a step toward me, the knife held at waist height, her small frame tense with potential energy, ready to explode into motion. I faltered, confused. What are you talking about? Despite my resolve, her words found their target. My father had been neglectful, yes, but I'd never doubted that in his way he had loved me. He had rescued me from her, had given me a home free from active abuse, had left me everything he had when he died. What lie was she referring to? He never wanted you, she spat. He left because he couldn't stand to look at you. You reminded him too much of me. The only reason he took you in was guilt. Guilt and the money. She advanced another step, her eyes never leaving mine, the knife moving in small circles as if seeking an opening. Her words poured out in a torrent now. as if she'd been waiting years to deliver this particular poison. Money? What money? My confusion was genuine. My father had never been wealthy. He'd worked as a manager at a local factory before his weight made it impossible for him to continue. Our house had been modest, our lifestyle simple. What money could she possibly be talking about? The trust fund, she said, as if it should be obvious. Your grandfather's money. The millions he left for you when you turned 21. The money your father was supposed to manage until then. She spoke with absolute conviction, her eyes bright with a fervor that suggested she truly believed what she was saying. Was this the delusion that had driven her actions? The belief that somewhere, somehow, there was a fortune with my name on it? I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. There's no trust fund. Dad left me the house and about $30,000, that's it. My grandfather, my father's father, had died when I was an infant. I had no memories of him, and my father had rarely spoken of him. The idea that he had left me millions was absurd. If such money had existed, surely I would have known about it by now. My mother's face twisted with rage. He stole it! He took your inheritance and hid it. That's why I came back, to get what's rightfully ours. Her delusion was complete, I realized. In her mind, there was a vast fortune that my father had somehow concealed, money that should have come to me, but that he had kept for himself. And in her twisted logic, this justified everything, the kidnapping, the threats, the violence, all to reclaim what she believed was rightfully ours. There's nothing to get, I said, but doubt crept in. My father had always been secretive about finances. Could there have been money I didn't know about? For a moment, I allowed myself to consider the possibility. My father had been a private man, keeping much of his life compartmentalized. There were boxes in the attic I had never opened, papers I had never read. Could there be truth in what she was saying? Had he hidden money that should have come to me? Number, this was just another of my mother's manipulations. Another lie to justify her actions. Even if there was, I said, it would be mine, not yours, never yours. I pushed the doubt away, focusing on the immediate threat. Whether or not there was hidden money was irrelevant now. What mattered was protecting Evan and my friends, stopping my mother before she could hurt anyone else. The bat felt solid in my hands as I adjusted my grip, preparing for whatever came next. Everything you have should be mine, she screamed, her composure finally cracking. I suffered for you, I sacrificed for you, and what did I get? Nothing. While you live in this house with your perfect husband and your perfect job. Her voice rose to a shriek, echoing in the confined space of the basement. Spittle flew from her lips as she screamed, her face contorted with a rage that seemed to consume her entirely. In that moment she was fully revealed, not the calculating manipulator or the wounded victim, but a creature of pure destructive envy. She lunged at me, the knife slashing through the air. I jumped back, swinging the bat instinctively. It connected with her arm, and she cried out in pain, the knife clattering to the floor. I kicked it away, keeping the bat between us. The bat connected with a sickening thud, the impact traveling up my arms and into my shoulders. My mother's scream was more rage than pain as she stumbled backward, clutching her arm. The knife skittered across the concrete floor, disappearing under the water heater. For a moment, we both stared at the spot where it had vanished, then at each other. The dynamic between us irrevocably changed. It's over, I repeated. You've lost. I stood my ground, the bat still raised defensively, my breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Behind my mother, I could see that Evan had managed to loosen his bond slightly, his wrists working against the duct tape. Casey had tipped her chair toward Marcus, and they were working together somehow, though I couldn't see exactly what they were doing. For a moment, she looked small and old and defeated. Then her eyes hardened, and she smiled, that same cold smile I remembered from childhood. Have I? She asked softly. Look around you, Mira. Look at what you've become. Her smile was chilling, the same expression she'd worn when I was a child, and she'd caught me in some minor transgression that would lead to disproportionate punishment. It was a smile that said she knew something I didn't, that no matter what happened next, she had already won some victory I couldn't yet see. I didn't need to look. I knew exactly what I'd become. I'd become strong enough to stop her, strong enough to protect the people I loved. I'm nothing like you, I said. The words were as much for myself as for her, a declaration of independence, a rejection of the legacy of abuse she had tried to pass down to me. I had broken the cycle. I had refused to become the monster she was. Even my rules, my attempt at poetic justice, had been a temporary measure born of shock and anger, not the systematic cruelty that defined her existence. Aren't you? She countered. The rules, the punishments, the control. You're more like me than you want to admit. She took a step toward me, her hands empty but somehow more threatening for it. Her words probed for weakness, for doubt, for the insecurities she had spent a lifetime cultivating in me. This was her true weapon, not the knife, but the poison of self-doubt she could inject with a few well-chosen words. Before I could respond, the basement door burst open, and police officers poured down the stairs, GANs drawn. Police! Freeze! The room was suddenly filled with movement and noise. Officers in tactical gear descending the stairs, shouting commands, their weapons trained on my mother. Light flooded the basement as more officers appeared at the storm cellar entrance behind me, having discovered the hidden access I had used. My mother raised her hand slowly, that smile still playing on her lips. She attacked me, she said, her voice suddenly trembling. My own daughter. She's unstable, just like her father. The transformation was immediate and complete, from raging kidnapper to frightened victim in the space of a heartbeat. Her hands trembled as she raised them, her posture shrinking, her voice taking on the quaver of an elderly woman confused by sudden violence. It was a performance I had seen countless times before, one that had fooled teachers, doctors, and social workers throughout my childhood. The officers approached cautiously, one moving toward me, the other toward my mother. Put down the bat, ma'am, the officer said to me. I lowered it slowly, never taking my eyes off my mother. The bat felt suddenly heavy in my hands, the adrenaline that had sustained me beginning to ebb. My arms ached, my legs trembled, but I remained standing, unwilling to show weakness while my mother could still see me. Check on them, I said, nodding toward Evan and my friends. They need medical attention. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, calm and authoritative despite the chaos around us. The officer nodded, signaling to his colleagues who moved quickly to the hostages, cutting their bonds and checking their injuries. Evan's eyes found mine across the room, filled with relief and something else, pride. More officers came down, followed by Detective Gray. They secured my mother, handcuffing her despite her protests of innocence. Paramedics arrived to tend to the hostages. "Are you all right?" Detective Gray asked me as my mother was led upstairs. Detective Gray's expression was a mixture of concern and admiration as he approached me. Behind him, paramedics were attending to Evan and my friends, checking vital signs, applying preliminary first aid to visible injuries. The basement was now brightly lit by portable lights the police had brought in, the scene taking on an almost surreal quality after the dim confrontation moments before. I watched her go, her back straight, her head high, still playing the role of the dignified victim. Even now, even after everything, she thought she could manipulate her way out of this. My mother walked between two officers, her small frame somehow managing to convey injured dignity despite the handcuffs. She didn't look back at me, but her posture spoke volumes, the set of her shoulders, the precise placement of each step. She was already planning her next performance, I knew, already crafting the story she would tell to lawyers, to judges, to anyone who would listen. "I will be," I said. The words were simple but honest. I wasn't all right now. How could I be, after everything that had happened? But I would be. For the first time in my life, I truly believed that. My mother was in custody. Evan was safe. The truth was finally coming to light. The long nightmare of her influence was ending. As they untied Evan, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with relief and love and something else. Understanding. He had seen the darkness in my family now. He had experienced firsthand what my childhood had been like. Evan's wrists were raw from the duct tape, blood seeping from where he had struggled against his bonds. A paramedic was cleaning the cut on his cheek, applying antiseptic that made him wince slightly. But his eyes never left mine, steady and warm despite the ordeal he had endured. In those eyes I saw no judgment, no fear of what I might become, only love, and the shared knowledge of what we had survived together. "I'm sorry," I whispered as I knelt beside him. "I'm so sorry she dragged you into this." I reached for his hand, careful to avoid the areas the paramedic was treating, his fingers curled around mine, warm and solid and real. After 2 weeks of fear and uncertainty, the simple touch was overwhelming. Proof that he was here, that he was alive, that we had survived. He shook his head weakly. "Not your fault," he managed to say. "Never your fault." His voice was hoarse but firm, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. In that moment, I felt something long broken inside me begin to heal. The guilt I had carried, for bringing my mother back into our lives, for exposing Evan to her cruelty, began to lift under the steady gaze of his understanding. I helped him to his feet, supporting him as we made our way upstairs. Outside, the street was filled with police cars and an ambulance, lights flashing in the early morning sun. Neighbors stood on their lawns, watching with undisguised curiosity. The bright sunlight was jarring after the dim basement, making me squint as we emerged into the day. Our quiet suburban street had been transformed. Police tape cordoned off our yard. Officers directed traffic around the emergency vehicles. Neighbors clustered in small groups, watching the drama unfold. Mrs. Patel from next door caught my eye and gave me a small, sympathetic nod. The Johnsons from across the street stood on their porch in bathrobes, coffee mugs in hand, their expressions a mixture of concern and fascination. My mother sat in the back of a police car, her face visible through the window. As we passed, her eyes met mine one last time. The police car was parked directly under the maple tree in our front yard, dappled sunlight playing across its roof. Through the window, I could see my mother sitting perfectly upright, her hands now cuffed in front of her, her expression composed. As our eyes met, I expected to feel something. Fear, anger, even pity. But there was nothing. The power she had held over me for so long had finally, completely broken. There was no remorse there. No recognition of the pain she had caused. Only cold calculation, already planning her next move. Her eyes were exactly as I remembered from childhood. Dark, watchful, evaluating. There was no trace of the trembling victim she had portrayed for the police, nor of the raging kidnapper from the basement. This was the real woman beneath the performances. Calculating, patient, utterly self-interested. I could almost see the thoughts moving behind those eyes, the strategies forming, the lies being constructed. But it didn't matter. Whatever she planned, whatever lies she told, I knew the truth now. And I was finally free of her shadow. The realization settled over me with surprising lightness. For so long I had carried the weight of her influence, the fear, the self-doubt, the constant vigilance. Now, watching her through the police car window, I understood that her power had always been an illusion. She was just a small, damaged woman whose only talent was for causing pain, and I had outgrown her. As the paramedics helped Evan into the ambulance, I turned back to look at my house, the house my father had left me, the home I had built for myself. It would never be the same after this, but maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time to start fresh, somewhere new, somewhere without the weight of the past pressing down on every corner. Our house stood as it always had, the blue shutters I'd painted last spring, the flower beds I'd planted along the front walk, the porch swing Evan had installed on our first anniversary. But now it seemed different, tainted by the violence that had occurred within its walls. The home I had created with such care, such hope for a normal life, now felt like just another stage for my mother's manipulations. "Ma'am?" A paramedic touched my arm. "Would you like to ride with your husband?" The paramedic was young, probably just a few years out of training, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He held the ambulance door open, waiting for my decision. Inside, I could see Evan on a stretcher, an IV already in his arm, an oxygen mask over his face. Casey, Stephanie, and Marcus were being attended to by other paramedics, their injuries being assessed and treated. I nodded, climbing into the ambulance beside Evan. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of my mother through the police car window. The ambulance interior was bright and sterile, the air heavy with the smell of antiseptic and plastic. I sat on a narrow bench beside Evan's stretcher, taking his hand carefully between mine. His fingers curled weakly around mine, and he tried to smile beneath the oxygen mask. The paramedic moved efficiently around us, checking monitors, adjusting the IV flow, recording vital signs on a clipboard. She was watching me, her expression unreadable. Then the ambulance pulled away, and she disappeared from view.
No.
Through the small rear windows of the ambulance, I watched my street recede, the police cars with their flashing lights, the neighbors still standing in clusters, my house growing smaller in the distance. And in one of those police cars, becoming just a tiny dot before disappearing entirely, was my mother. For the first time in my life, I was truly leaving her behind. The ambulance turned a corner, and everything vanished from sight. I looked down at Evan, at our intertwined hands, at the future we still had together despite everything my mother had done. The road ahead would be difficult. Recovery, police statements, probably a trial. But we would face it together, free from the shadow that had haunted my entire life. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Hope, uncontaminated by fear. Whatever came next, my mother's power was broken. The cycle of abuse had ended, and I was at last free.